Well, welcome everyone. Again, if you joined early, you already heard me say, this is the Innovate Pasadena Ask an Expert series. We invite a local innovation leader every month to join us and answer your questions about a variety of topics. And today we are joined by Harrison Tang, the CEO of Spokeo, and he's going to be answering your questions about Web 3.0 and decentralized identity. So Harrison, I know that was a quick intro. You could take it away and tell us a little bit more about Web 3.0.
Cool. Well, thank you. Thank you, Beth. And thank you for Innovate Pasadena to invite me to talk about this topic. So a quick introduction about myself. I'm Harrison Tang. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Spokeo, also dad of 3 sons. So you can actually find me and follow me on LinkedIn, the CEO Dad. That's my handle, pretty self-explanatory. If you haven't heard of Spokeo, we're one of the biggest people search engine digital identity platform that aggregates around 15 billion records into 600 million entities or profiles to help around 15 million users to search, connect, and know who they're dealing with. So the question of identity, or the question of who we are, or as Shakespeare would put it, right, to be or not to be, the question of existence, is quite relevant to what we do. And today I would like to kind of talk about and answer any questions that you might have in regards to what's next for the web, right? The topic of Web 3.0. And also the topic of decentralized identity, right? In the context of Web 3.0, how is identity, or your identity, going to evolve over time in the next 10 years or so? Okay, so before we start, I would just like to kind of lay the groundwork for the definitions, or FAQ, frequently asked questions, if you will. So the first question obviously is, what is Web 3.0? So this is a hype term that's being thrown around quite a bit, and multiple different people have multiple definitions, but more or less the central theme for the Web 3.0 is the idea of decentralization. And what is decentralization? Well, decentralization by definition is the opposite of centralization, which is the control, the authority, right, or the power lies within a few, or a single or a few entities. So decentralization is opposite of that, where the power, the control, the authority does not lie within a single or few entities. So that is the common theme in Web 3.0, and there's many different things on top of that, right? For example, if you put some economics on top of decentralization, you'll get into token-based economies, right? One of the most famous example will be Bitcoin, right? And then there's distributed ledger technologies. A lot of people equate distributed ledger technologies such as blockchain to decentralization. I think that's a pretty narrow-minded definition, and I'll talk about what that means. And if you have questions, I can get into those details. But the main concept of Web 3.0 is the idea of decentralization. Put into layman's terms, right? If you think about Web 1.0 in the 1990s, mid 1990s, it's about putting information online. It's empowering users to actually consume content. In mid 2000s and 2010s, the Web 2.0 era, right, which is kind of best represented as like, for example, social networks. It's empowering users not to just consume content, but also generate content. Web 3.0 is about not just helping users to consume, generate, but also own, right, their digital identity. The concept of ownership becomes the center of the Web 3.0, essentially. So if Web 0.0 can be described as read, Web 2.0 is read and write, then Web 3.0 is read, write, and own, right? This concept of ownership that lies within billions of people, such as you and I, right? That's the center theme of Web 3.0 and decentralization. Now, if we want to talk about decentralized identity, then we need to define what identity is, right? Identity in English is data attributes and characteristics about a distinct entity. And then there's another discipline called identity and access management. So I think the definition of identity is accessible information and characteristics and attributes about distinct entities. So there's three dimensions to the definition of identity, right? One is the idea of being, right? What is an entity? And then the second is obviously information and data attributes, right? Data aggregation, which is what Spokeo is known for. That's one aspect of identity. And lastly is access management and control, which actually includes topics such as data privacy and so on and so on. So decentralized identity, if you think about it, there's multiple different projects involved, but I would group it into these three kinds. One is decentralized identifier, which talks about decentralizing entity. The second one is decentralized access. One of the example is decentralized triangle, decentralized trust. And lastly is decentralized data aggregation, right? So there is multiple different projects, but roughly that's how I would categorize them because ultimately we got to get to the definitions. I mean, Spokeo is a data company. We like to be exact about our definitions. You know, if you want to solve a problem, you need to know exactly and clarify what problem you're trying to solve. So decentralized identities, if you bring to those smaller chunks, will be decentralized access, decentralized identifier, and lastly, decentralized data aggregation. Okay, so that's the preamble, a little foundation and a framework. And also just want to first answer the FAQs around this topic of decentralized identity and Web 3.0. All right, Beth, I think there are some questions.
Yeah, so we do have, and we're already getting some questions in from the live audience as well, but folks, when they signed up for the event, did ask you some questions ahead of time. So our first one, we had someone ask, how do you feel about apps that connect brands and users in a way that compensates people for their data?
You know, this idea really reminds me of back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where, you know, there are ideas about paying you to browse the internet, right? Net zero, right? It's free. The internet is free. You don't have to pay for it, right? So we're going to, you browse it for free, right? Or you click the ads and then we'll return the money to you. So this reminds me of that quite a bit, honestly. And I can't say whether it'll work or not, but this is what I will say. Data ultimately is the mean to the end, not the end itself. So what does that mean? So in the marketing context, for example, data by itself is actually not that valuable. It's what you can do with that data. So for example, you can leverage data to create audience segments, right? You can leverage data to expand your target audience with lookalike algorithms, right? So data is the mean that powers the end, right? And the audience, honestly, is about expanding your marketing, essentially, and assuming that marketing is positive ROI, right? Bringing in dollars at the end of the day. That's the end. Data in the example of identity verification, for example, when you're trying to create an account or create a banking account and things like that, you know, the data actually helps the banks verify that you are who you say you are. So the data is actually the mean to the end. The end is not the data itself. The end is actually creating an account and allow you to access, right, your bank account. So data is the mean to the end, not the end itself. So in my opinion, data really is not a marketplace. It's the marketplace on top of the marketplace, or what I call meta marketplace. Or you can think of it as a derivative, using an analogy. It's a derivative on top of the asset, not the asset itself. So if physical currency captures the value of the marketplace, then then really what we're talking about is a derivative value on top of that, right? And is the derivative value best captured by the regular physical currency, such as the US dollar? I'm not so sure about that. I think the best value currency or vehicle of value is best represented with something that doesn't have too many derivatives on top of it. So long story short, I personally think because of this indirect relationships between the data monetization of data to the end, whether it's identity verifications or actually fraud preventions and so on and so on. I personally think this idea is probably not the best one, in my opinion. Mhm.
All right. And we'll move on to our next question here. By definition, will my personal identity be anonymous across all of Web 3.0?
So by definition, the answer is no, right? Like Web 3.0 has nothing to do with anonymity and things like that. And by the way, a lot of people interchange the idea of anonymity with security, right? Security is making sure that the data access is not being abused, right? It doesn't restrict data access. Whereas anonymity is just about lack of information, right? So the Web 3.0 and decentralized identity is actually not about killing information. It's actually not about that. It's actually making the information sharing more secure and personalized so that you can trust them more, right? So the short answer to the question, is the decentralized identity about anonymity? The answer is no. And the definition of decentralized identity has nothing to do with anonymity as well. It's about empowering users, right? Billions of users, such as you and I, to really control the flow of information about ourselves.
Okay, we've got another one here. This is going in a different direction. Do you believe that AR will ultimately reign supreme over VR?
So I think different technology have different use cases. And by the way, I'm not a AR, VR expert, so I can't really predict whether they will succeed or not, whether which one will win or not. So that I can't really predict. This is what this is what I will say though. Reality is beyond just what we see, right? AR and VR is about experiences. It's about recreating what people see, right, in the virtual setting, or augmenting what people see with virtual items. But it only deals with the space, right? X, Y, and Z. And the reality is, as we know, more than space, right? Reality, quoting Einstein, actually includes time, space-time continuum. And honestly, reality is more than just X, Y, Z, and T. It actually includes things like personality. That's a dimension in a reality as well. So reality and the idea of digital world is beyond what you just see. So AR and VR really touches around the experience. Spokeo and decentralized identity is trying to solve the reality too, but those reality a lot of times is not what you see, right? It's actually beyond the space dimensions that typical people can sense. It's actually more than that. So long story short, to that question about AR and VR, unfortunately, I can't really answer it. But that said, all of us are trying to recreate this new world, right? The digital world, or the parallel universe, whatever you call it. But this parallel universe and the digital world, in my opinion, is beyond just X, Y, and Z. We're recreating the space that we see.
Okay, and we have a question from our live audience here. Eric asks, do you believe that targeting advertising can work with privacy protections like Neon ID or Solid are trying to introduce?
Yes, of course. I mean, data privacy is defined, right, in sociology as the control over levels of data access about oneself or a group's self, right? So it's about access control, right? Ultimately, data privacy is an access control discipline. And by the way, there's a difference between privacy, which touches upon the intent of the access, and security, which is about okay, these are the rules. Are people abusing the rules, right? So there's the difference between privacy and security, but ultimately these disciplines are all part of the access control and access management. And I do think that having a strong, right, privacy or security and things like that is what's going to happen. But none of these are going to restrict the data access. It's just going to make it more secure, make it more personalized, right? So for example, what do I mean by personalized? So for example, I don't mind sharing my social security number with my wife and my mom. But I think a random guy on the street, that's probably not so smart, right? And then different people also have different feelings about privacy or data sharing preferences, and my answers might be different, like if you ask someone else, right? So how do we actually personalize all these things? These are active projects and active discussion points in many different cutting edge technologies. And I think, all of these are just going to make users, or all of us, trust the data sharing and data flows a lot better. But I don't think the revolution of data revolution will go backwards. I don't think cars are going back to horse carriages. Okay, I think there's only going to be more data, not less. But the future of data revolution, I think, is about personalization, security, and so on. Mm-hmm.
Ooh, so we have a related question here, a relevant question to what you're just talking about, from Christian, who says, back to identity and control, will the decentralization of personal data in Web 3.0 prevent entities from selling third-party data that has been captured or collected?
That's a very good question. I don't think it will prevent it. But that said, you will actually legitimize and create, it will transfer and evolve and move a lot of the current data sharing activities to self-sovereign identity. So the best analogy I would use is streaming music, for example, right? So before Spotify, Apple Music, or actually iPods, right? People are using Pirate Bay and things like that. Now with legal streaming music platforms getting more popular, did BitTorrent die? No, people are still using it. It didn't die, right? There's still a lot of very valid use cases for those technologies. But that said, most people move to music streaming, basically, right? And I think that analogy holds true here. I don't think if the question is, will the current paradigm die? I don't think they will. There's many different valid use cases that will require the current paradigm. But that said, with the new paradigm, the self-sovereign identity paradigm, I think it will move a lot of the use cases to this consent-based approach. Mm-hmm.
So Robbie is asking, what are some ways that you foresee decentralized data and identity management affecting the physical world?
That's a very, very good question. So most of the decentralized identity world is evolving in the digital realm, right? So for example, decentralized identifier, that's a digital identifier, right? So there is a protocol called decentralized identifier. It's a W3C protocol. That's talking about how do we make sure that the identifiers, right, are universal yet not controlled by a single entity, right? And then another protocol, verifiable credential, which is part of decentralized access. I mean, that's talking about data access, right? And in the digital world. So none of this actually touches the physical world at this moment. The interface between the physical world and the digital world is a problem called authentication, right? So you can use the analogy of for example, analog to digital conversion in electrical engineering, same thing. How do you convert from carbon footprints? I mean, we're all made of carbons in physical world to silicon, right? How do you do carbon to silicon conversions? That's the problem called authentication. And right now, that area, there's some work in that, but it's not really in the decentralized world at this moment. So most of the work today is actually on the digital realm that I see. And then there's interface projects that ties the physical to the digital world. So at this moment, I don't see a lot of big immediate direct impacts, but indirectly, I think obviously as people's activities move more and more online, I think as our lives becomes digital and physical becomes more and more blurred, obviously there will be a lot of indirect impacts, but directly at this moment in the world of decentralized identity, I don't see a direct impacts to the physical world yet.
Give it time. All right. Rob asks, what do you see as low-hanging fruit when it comes to implementing Web3 applications to solving a real-world challenge, like buying real estate, secure social media?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, first of all, we need to really understand what problem identity solve in general, and then we can talk about how this decentralized approach to identity helps the existing solutions does do it better, right? So identity, as I mentioned, is the mean to the end, right? So an example of identity verification or account opening, for example, when you're trying to open an account, the banks or the institutions or companies want to make sure that you're a real person, right? So currently, a lot of the identity verifications happens in the back end, right? So the decentralized approach will make sure that the users actually understand that the identity verification is happening, So those kind of processes become more transparent. So the decentralized approach really is putting the users in the center of those transactions at this moment that they don't know even exist. So that's really the main benefits of decentralization. Now, obviously there are challenges because when you put users in control, that sounds great, but the user interface implications is quite large, right? So if the cost of decentralization means that user has to go through like 20 steps of screens, I think most people would be like, forget the decentralized identity. I'm just going to go back to the old ways, right? So I think that's basically the main challenge here is that how do we actually put users in control without sacrificing the user friendliness, right? Without really, for lack of better term, streamlining the user experience so that the decentralized identity can be made simple, right? So I think that's the main challenge. But ultimately, going back to the question, identity is the mean to the end, right? Whether it's identity verification, fraud mitigation, login. For example, when you do social login, that's one problem that identity actually solves. It's called identity and access management. So it's the mean to the end, and the decentralized approach really is about empowering users and putting users in the middle of those approach so that they know what's going on. And the challenge is, how do we make sure that the decentralized approach does not compromise the user friendliness? And that's that. Mm-hmm.
All right. So I know you've agreed to stay a couple extra minutes if we have more questions coming in. And so folks, if you want to ask your question, ask Harrison now, go ahead and type it in the Q&A. We have a couple more minutes with him here. And I'm just curious, were there any questions you had in the back of your mind, Harrison, that you thought people would ask that they haven't asked so far? Like anything that folks usually want to talk about when you're discussing identity management and decentralized identity?
No, I think we got pretty good questions. So if there are more questions that the audience have, I'll try to answer as best as I can.
And we do have another question in here from Christian. Given the bad behavior that's prevalent online, are DAOs a workable framework for governance?
So that's a very good question. So first of all, for those who don't know, DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organizations. I think in theory, it sounds great, but just like smart contracts in theory sounds great. Like, hey, you write these parameters on top of the chain, but and then no one can change it. It's there forever. But in practice, as we all know, people found loopholes in in the contracts, and then actually siphons off like quite a bit of money, right, from the Ethereum chain, I believe. So I think DAO sounds good in theory, but in practice, I think you can always codify things, right? You can codify things, but the interpretation is always a little bit subjective. So I think, how do we create a very, very robust, and by the way, is it even possible to create the most robust framework out there, right? Maybe robustness is dependent on time. In other words, nothing is robust over time, right? So if that's the case, right? If that's the case, then I don't think DAO will ever work, right? Because if the robustness of systems degrade over time, then I think DAO will have, as it currently stands, will have a lot of challenges. But that said, the DAO can also evolve over time as well, right? So the answer, unfortunately, is I don't really know, right? Practically speaking, but in theory, it sounds like a pretty good dream.
Jean asks, your view on Metaverse and whether Facebook, Zuckerberg should have sole control of the Metaverse. Sounds like a little loaded question there.
So first of all, we need to talk about what Metaverse is. I think the prevalent definition of Metaverse is basically VR, essentially a new kind of VR. Then in those kind of definitions, then yes, I think Facebook pull quite a bit of money. The big techs are pull quite a bit of money. They want to create a vertically integrated hardware plus software system, so they can have a lock-in, right? Just like they have in computers and mobile phones and so on and so on. So I think that is part of what's going to happen. But in my opinion, Metaverse is beyond just recreating space. As I mentioned earlier, I think the universe and the reality of the universe is beyond just space-time continuums. So, well, it's beyond space for sure. At least that's what I believe, right? If you believe in Einstein, it's beyond space, right? There's a space-time continuum with gravity as the dimension that changes that fabric. So I think the universe fundamentally is beyond just X, Y, and Z. So in that sense, I don't think the narrow-minded definitions of metaverse that most people buy to today, I think the broad definition of metaverse, I think is still Wild Wild West. It's still open for innovations.
Awesome. So it seems like we are about out of questions. It looks like everyone's sort of wrapping up here. Is there anything you'd like to add to the audience? Any words of wisdom or plugs for Spokeo, anything at all?
No, I think if you guys are interested in this subject, just follow me on the LinkedIn. Again, my LinkedIn handle is the CEO Dad. It's pretty self-explanatory. I'm the CEO and a dad, and or on Twitter, it's the same thing. Or if you're if you're young, use TikTok, right? My TikTok account is 10 Talks, 10 with Talks, TOKS. So you can just follow me there, and then I'll talk about this this subject from time to time.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Harrison. Again, we're super, super happy to have you as part of the Pasadena community, Spokeo as part of the Pasadena community. And again, to everyone here, thank you for joining us, and check out innovatepasadena.org or follow us on LinkedIn. We do these Ask an Experts every month, so sign up for our newsletter to learn what's next. Thank you, everyone.